All right, so greetings, everyone. Welcome to our conversation today about COP27. Just briefly introduce myself and our discussing today. For those of you who don't know, my name is Akuno, representing the Institute for Social Ecology in our discussion around race and the ecology and climate change. As you know, we've been doing a whole host of series on these particular subjects throughout 2022. We're going to continue in 2023. We're going to start basically the year taking several dives into the COP27 process and the COP process overall, just where that process is at, and more importantly, how we can and must kind of intervene in this process. So I had the pleasure and the honor to be part of a delegation that went to Sharm El Sheikh in Egypt for COP27. Was part of the Grassroots Global Justice delegation, and it was part of a larger delegation of It Takes Roots. And there we got to reconnect with many of our partners and allies, which includes Dorothy, who you all are about to meet if you're not familiar with her. Dorothy Guerrero is with Global Justice Now, based out of the UK. Long-term I would say, fighter for justice, originally from the Philippines, and is one of the key people, I think, really kind of really analyzing a lot of the global connections from my vantage point of things I've seen of her work over the years, and some of the work that we are pleasantly doing together. Through several different working groups, trying to make some connections. So I just want to introduce you all to her and get this piece really going. As you know, we've been doing report backs on this kind of COP process to monitor it, since the last one, which was held in Glasgow in Scotland, which was COP26, and wanted to follow that up in particular, so that everybody is informed who didn't get a chance, an opportunity to go there, which is the vast majority of us, just given how these things are kind of organized. But more importantly, the essential question, at least to me, is if we follow the science, we follow all of the information, we know that we are on a very short and tight timeline to make real impact, right? To basically end the worst damages that could happen from runaway climate change, right? From runaway temperature increase. The goal was set in Paris of trying to keep, the globe from warming no more than 1.5. That was hardly, unfortunately, mentioned at COP27. I think Dorothy will touch on that. But I wanted to just, let me start with, there was an article from The Guardian, which I think it was from the very beginning of the COP. There's an article that did some framing. I just want to share a little bit and read a little bit actually of it. And then from there, really set Dorothy up with a set of questions to really go through. And so, the article was the world is on highway to climate hell. UN chief warns at COP27. Antonio Guterres tells leaders global climate fight will be won or lost in this crucial decade on our watch. And in the article, just a quick section of it, humanity is, quote unquote, on a highway to hell, the UN Secretary General has warned, saying the fight for a livable planet will be won or lost in this decade. Antonio Guterres told world leaders at the opening of the COP27 UN Climate Summit in Egypt on Monday We are in the fight of our lives and we are losing. And our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. Quote, we are on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. He said the world faced a stark choice over the next fortnight of talks. Either developed and developing countries work together to make, quote, a historic pact, unquote, that will reduce greenhouse emissions and set the world on a low carbon path, or failure would bring about climate breakdown and catastrophe. We can sign a climate solidarity pact or collective suicide pact, he added. He said the world has the tools it needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a clean energy and low carbon technology. A window of opportunity remains open, but only a narrow shaft of light remains, he said. The global climate fight will be won or lost in this crucial decade on our watch. One thing is for certain, that those that give up are sure to lose, right? So I wanted to really highlight that, because I think it was some of the only honest conversation that was had officially at the COP, right? In that, from my vantage point, the negotiations basically just kind of wavered off from there, right? And we'll get into that. But, you know, the COP27 had a mission, and I'm asking you, Dorothy, from your participation there, do you think it succeeded or failed in its mission?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Kali, and also thank you for that introduction, because that actually frames the whole climate politics, and at the same time what is not happening in the climate negotiations. So what's the background of this highway to hell, and the fact that we should do something dramatic within this decade? Well, what the UN Secretary General was referring to is the fact that there is a carbon budget, and the carbon budget that was discussed, it refers to the fact that from the onset of the Industrial Revolution until today, so we're talking here of 200 years, humanity has used up approximately 83% of its carbon budget. And of course, when we say humanity, it's not equal. You know, not everyone contributed at the same amount or the same intensity. But that 83% amount, that's the amount of carbon the atmosphere, or the budget is the amount of carbon the atmosphere can absorb. And exceeding that would mean that we will go beyond the aspirational goal of the Paris Climate Agreement, which is the one do not go beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in global temperature. So since the pre-industrial era. So the question is, the remaining 17%, how will that be used up? So who should reduce, and who can use that more of that remaining 17%? And also, how can we make sure that that remaining 17% will not be used up before the end of the century? And that's the problem, because if we're talking of that remaining 17%, the calculations based on the national pledges of all the countries, the 192 signatories to the Paris Agreement, so far since 2015 until the last COP last November, all the pledges, all the nationally determined contribution will go beyond that remaining 17% of the remaining carbon budget. So meaning we're really in this dire situation, and that at the current rate of emissions, the budget will be used up within the next decade. And that calculation, actually, we're not talking about today or this month. That calculation was since 2015. So meaning, if we look at the remaining carbon budget, there are various, these are very, very sophisticated calculations. There are also warnings that we may trip that level of 1.5 degrees centigrade, maybe in the next two or next, even before 2030. And that is what is really scary. Because as we know, at this point, the global warming is at 1.2 degrees centigrade since the Industrial Revolution. And at this point, the US is, as you mentioned, is already experiencing a lot of unprecedented and at the same time unpredictable weather changes. Countries like where I came from in the Philippines, normally we could predict when the monsoon will hit, what's the period. Normally we can say from June to August, but now that's becoming totally unpredictable. And stronger typhoons are happening. And also here in Europe, in the last 2 years, for the first time, countries like the UK, Germany, had experienced unprecedented floodings, and that's just one of the more visible impacts. Not to mention Pakistan, which wherein you have the whole country underwater for weeks, and then this kind of impacts or catastrophe does not just affect the infrastructure or does not just affect livelihoods, which is already dramatic, but at the same time, that for many developing countries, the capacity to recover is not the same as the capacity of, say, the US or Germany or the UK. So at the current rate of emission, it is really important that we have this in mind, that we understand what is this carbon budget. And also to understand that those countries who became rich in a world wherein there was still no carbon budget to speak about, emitted greenhouse gases and are responsible for much of the destruction we are facing today. That is why in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, there are categories of countries that are historic and huge emitters, and there are countries that although they are big emitters now, they are not also categorized as historic emitters. And then you also have countries, small island states, the least developed countries, the developing countries, who have not contributed much on that 83% of the approximate carbon that was used up to reach this level of emissions. So it is important to keep that in mind, that those who became rich also included countries that colonized other countries, and at the same time continuing that huge emission, although we are now in a post-colonial period, but there's a continuing emission based on their investments, especially on fossil fuels, based on the lifestyle differences as well. That's why in the current discussions now, in terms of what we do, there are also suggestions that we really need to tax the top 1% of the population, because they are the ones that are really using up this carbon budget more than the others. So when we talk about humanity having the responsibility, not everyone is equal on that. And so the inequality is not just between countries, but also within countries, there are differences. Those who are in the rich areas, of course, consume more, or those that are the top 1% of the population consume more. Those who flew to Sharm El Sheikh and also in Glasgow in the last COP on their personal jets also use up more than the others. And then also when it comes to sectors, there's also differences when we say, because all economic activities emit emissions, but there's a big difference when we say emissions being used for flying a jet for someone to attend a meeting or attend a party in another city, and someone who's producing food, for example, or when it comes to mass transportation, for example. So there are those differences that we have to take in mind. And if we will go back to that discussion on that disparity, because of this large disparity in emissions and in the wealth earned alongside those emissions, the rich countries of the north owe the poorer countries. It's a kind of climate debt, as the global south were mentioning. So that climate debt means that when it comes to who owes whom, that also put into consideration the fact that many developing countries are now paying a tremendous amount of money based on the automatic appropriation of the national budget in paying off the foreign debts to the international financial institutions. And they were asking why they're paying that much and at the same time paying a lot when it comes, or incurring more debts when it comes to addressing the impacts of climate change, when in fact they are actually owed a huge amount of climate debt by rich nations. And when we talk now of how do we control carbon emissions, the big question in the negotiation is what's the fair share of each country's. That's why, if you remember in COP26, the whole discussion is the US putting its fair share, and that comes into two levels. One is on reducing emissions, and at the same time doing the finance and technological transfer to the developing countries. So the finance and developing country, the finance and technology transfer to developing countries should not be seen as something charitable to be done by rich nations to developing countries. It is actually an obligation within the framework of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That is very, very clear in the text of the UNFCCC document, the convention document. So in the last negotiation, there were actually three kinds of negotiations. You still have the negotiation under that UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. There is also the negotiation under the Kyoto Protocol, which is still a universally legally binding document, and also the Paris Agreement, which is saying that we have this decade to address the impact of climate change and not reach the minimum level of 1.5. If we look back in the negotiation as well, way back in Copenhagen in 2009, there was already this debate on what is safe, because the conversation on what is safe for whom? The small islands developing countries were saying, for us, it is one degree centigrade. That should be the floor and not the ceiling, because they're facing the consequence of rising sea levels. In fact, way back in 1991, Vanuatu already raised the question: will we be paid reparations for that sea level rise? And from 1991, it's only in 2013 that the Warsaw document on loss and damage was entered into the text. And since 2013, it is only this year, 2022, that the loss and damage was established. So imagine how slow the process is, and that is one reason why we can also say that the negotiation is not fit to purpose, because we are talking here of emission reduction, which is not happening since the start of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1991. When it comes to the particulate matters in the atmosphere, we are at that time what is called the ppm. We are at that time at 320, and now we are at 420. So meaning from 1991 until now, we really the world did not really reduce emissions. And until now, the developing countries are still fighting for that finance and technology transfer. So maybe I will stop there, and then we can continue the discussion if there are any question or any issue that you wanted to raise, because I know that we still need to discuss, is the establishment of loss and damage a victory? What we gained? What did the COP27 brought about?
Well, if you could give us your opinion on that, then we can go on into kind of a question and answer.
Yeah,
I think that would be helpful, just to kind of set a ground floor for us.
Okay. So the COP27, the developing countries did not came back totally empty-handed. At least we can consider that there are two minor victories nonetheless, because if you come to think of the fact that 1991, when Vanuatu requested for reparations, and loss and damage is part of that reparation, it's not equivalent to reparation. It is just one aspect of climate reparations. So the demand to address the climate-induced loss and damage was first raised by Vanuatu in 1991. It's only this year that it was set up. But at the same time, this was set up, but it's still an empty pot. So the fact that it's there can be considered a small victory because we can have something to negotiate in the future COP. And also, if we look back in Glasgow, actually, this loss and damage was the big debate because the US, the countries in the EU, the UK, at the same time, Japan, Norway, Australia, all these rich countries blocked the issue of finance and did not allow meaningful discussions on how to assess and address the loss and damage finance gap. So the loss and damage also is considered another pillar in the finance discussion within the negotiation, because we also have the discussion on climate finance for mitigation, which is how you reduce the emissions. There's also the climate finance for adaptation. How can we fund what countries need in order to adapt to climate change? But then because of the argument by developing countries, and this is actually a just argument, there are impacts of climate change that many countries could no longer adapt to. When you talk about loss of territories because of rising sea levels, then it is no longer adaptation because you already lost your territory. That's why this concept of loss and damage came to the fore. And within the negotiations as well, you have different blocks. So the biggest block, you have the G77 China, which is actually a group of 134 developing countries. And then you also have the small island developing states. You have the least developed countries. You have the Latin American and African countries who demand for this loss and damage fund. So in a way, establishing that fund is a victory for all these countries. So the question of how do we put money in the pot is the next hurdle. And in Glasgow, the blockage from the rich countries say that, no, we will have the dialogue instead. And the dialogue could take up to 3 years. So actually, having the loss and damage this year is we cut that 3 year in dialogue. So the next question of how do we fund this? There are many proposals from developing countries, which include, for example, of course, within the UNFCCC, there is the polluter must pay principle. But at this moment, the question of who will pay is no longer just limited to the rich countries, because many are also advancing the idea, and it is gaining popularity, that the transnational corporations, especially the fossil fuel corporations, should also now begin to pay. Part of the movements in the policy or climate governance as well is the notion that we should tax fossil fuel corporations on their untaxed earnings, and at the same time, that alone can put already millions of dollars on the pot. And to think that this year alone, 2022, we have a research in Global Justice Now that just 5 corporations have already earned $170 billion this year alone. So that means we can talk here about a huge amount of money when we talk about how do we tax that kind of income. The second victory that we can say, which can be addressed within the UNFCCC, but also linked to the UNFCCC and outside the process of the UNFCCC, is the breakthrough that was made in the entered in the text for the first time. There is a strong call for structural reform of the international financial architecture to better serve both climate and development goals. So this has been discussed in many policy circles, that we could not address climate change if we don't address that question of the international financial architecture. So that means actually a historic consensus to revise the Bretton Woods system. And this has been a demand for many developing countries. So how do we go about that is, of course, again, another discussion, another negotiation, which could be within the UNFCCC, or also, if we remember, every year there are meetings of the Bretton Woods institutions. The World Bank and the IMF meets in Washington every year. So then with this wording in the document, which is a universal and legally binding text, there will be that kind of, because of that call. And of course, I will not say that this is a huge victory, because within the negotiation, there are differences when you say to call or to establish, or the should and the must in the text. So there are this gradation of how actions can be done, but a call is a good start to begin with.
Thank you for that, Dorothy. And one thing before we go to the questions, there's one more thing to ask you. Some of my previous reporting, I talked about the actual limits to civil society, right, to the social movements at this COP. And we know the next one, which is going to be, I believe in Doha, is going to be even more limited. And one of the things that I would note to everybody, and I tried to really highlight, was kind of the diminishing voice of social movements in this process over the last couple of years. It's been up and down. I think Glasgow was kind of one of that, and Paris were probably some of the high points in the last decade at least. There have been other high points. I'd say Copenhagen, some years ago being another one. But they've really limited the space. And I think it winds up having an impact on the actual negotiations when, kind of political and civil society actors are not there to kind of advocate, to lobby, to apply pressure. So I want you to, if you can, to give us a breakdown of how you think the limiting the impact and the role of civil society is going to impact the negotiations, particularly around, mitigation, damage and loss, adaptation, etc., and some of the other in demands that some of the social movements are raising for, like reparations, etc. So, to touch on that, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Yes. Well, 2 points actually. The first is that when it comes to the UN understanding what is civil society, that there is a big problem in that, because in the UN framework, civil society are all actors that are not government. So the reason why it's called conference of parties equals government. So climate ministers and diplomats that are negotiating on the text of the agreement. But when you talk about non-government organization, that's a very, very broad term, because that includes non-government organizations per se, think tanks, institutions. There are also those so-called constituencies, which includes farmers and peasants, indigenous people, women, youth, small businesses, and big business as well. Corporations are seen as non-government organizations. And then you have environmental groups. You have you also have local government units that are all included in this category of non-government organization. In the COP or in Glasgow, one of the things that we've raised our voice on is that the increasing space and power given to fossil fuel lobbyists. In Glasgow, you have around 500 of them. In Sharm El Sheikh, there's 633 of them. So that's a 25% increase from the fossil fuel lobbyists. And some of them, there's also a new category now of party overflow, which they also have the pink badge. And if you ask, what is party overflow? So they are part of the party, but some of them can also be consultants from fossil fuel oil companies. So many of these fossil fuel lobbyists came to the negotiation as party overflow. And of course, the big scandal as well is that an executive of BP, the British Petroleum, which is one of the big 5 fossil fuel corporations, came as a legal or as a member of the official delegation of Mauritania. So how can a BP executive be a party of a developing country, be an official delegation of a developing country? And in the past, we already noticed this, that many of the African countries, you will see Shell lobbyists within the Shell and other 5 the big 5 and other fossil fuel lobbyists in the official delegation. So that's one problem. And that number 663 is actually bigger in terms of the number of delegation than, say, the least developing country delegation. And in the COP, there is a big difference if you have a huge delegation. I remember I don't know the number of the US delegate this year, but I remember the biggest discrepancy that I know was in the COP15 in Copenhagen, where the US delegate had more than 1,000 members of the delegation, while countries like Malawi has 4. So when it comes to a negotiation wherein in the second week, you have parties negotiating from 9 in the morning until 1, 2 in the morning the next day, it is a big advantage if you have a big delegation. And that means you have, yes, I think it was close to 1,100 this year. Okay, so it's consistent that the US delegation remained big. That means on the very important moment, where especially the last 3-4 days, wherein negotiators don't sleep anymore, it's a big advantage if you have 1,100 climate experts in your delegation than, say, when you have countries with a delegate of 4 or 12 or 49. I think the Philippine delegation around 60, if I'm not mistaken. And normally, countries differ because that's why there is different capacities, because the cost itself of sending delegations to the COP, you have to think of cost of flying, cost of accommodating them, and the budget for their daily expenses, because COPs normally last for 2 weeks, and most of the time it also extends up to 1 to 2 days. The Sharm El Sheikh negotiation was supposed to be from November 6 to 18, and it stretched up to 9 in the morning of November 20. That on the last day, we were waiting for the closing session that was supposed to be 11 in the evening, and it happened at 4 o'clock in the morning the next day. So it's a question of who's still awake and who still has the stamina to negotiate over this marathon type of negotiation. So the second point there, and the second point I wanted to discuss as well in this imbalance of the number also is there are differences in the power within. So let's face it, there is the power dynamics within the COP as well. So you have countries that, because of the global politics, there's a difference when the US say something and when countries like Mali or Djibouti or Laos or Cambodia say something. Of course, compared to the meetings of the World Trade Organization or the international financial institutions, in the UN, it's still one country, one vote. And they still decide on consensus. But there is also that realpolitik inside. And many think that when there is a conference of the parties, you have all these people from all these 192 or 196 countries, be it government or NGOs or indigenous people or women, they all come to the COP to save the world. The thing is, no, there are, as I mentioned, those fossil fuel lobbyists whose job is to prevent the appropriate action and the appropriate results to happen. And we have seen this in the last 27 COPs, wherein when it comes to that target of decreasing emissions, especially the fact that in this last COP, the language on the just fossil fuel phase out and the critical measures to make that happen did not end up in the final text. In the COP in Glasgow, they only discuss about coal. They refuse still to discuss about oil and gas phase out. And that is also another very, very difficult and challenging discussion, because although there is that universal agreement now compared to 30 years ago, that the main source of climate change for fossil fuels, there is also the different reality within countries. Because there's a big difference when you say that the US being a historic and huge emitter, and at the same time, the top oil producer and exporter, there's a big difference also when we talk about a developing country like Bolivia, whose main product is also oil, but at the same time, it is being used to fund social welfare. So there's a big difference where that money comes from. So within civil society, there's also that debate, especially in developing countries. First, let's discuss about how do we nationalize and socialize ownership of fossil fuel sectors. Because also the idea is you can't phase out, you can't plan if you don't own it. If it is within the control of transnational corporations, then you can't talk about the phase out because you can't plan it. You can't plan the decades, because it could not happen overnight. It needs several decades. So when we talk about fossil fuel, the end of fossil fuels, we should have started 20, 30 years ago. Until now, it is not on the text. And there is also a development now. Vanuatu joined the Maldives in calling for a UN fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which is another massive campaign now. But the question of how will that happen? Will it be an organized or orderly transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy, or will it be a chaotic one? Will still be a long discussion. Who will first do it? Who will be allowed to continue? So that reminded me of the negotiation on the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, wherein the world created a two-tier of countries, where some countries were allowed to continue producing nuclear and some countries were not allowed. So that could happen as well. So how do we prevent that from happening? That if there will be, I see it like a long years of negotiation as well. If there will be an agreement on non-fossil fuel proliferation treaty, what will that involve? What will be the elements of that treaty? So, but that's another COP, maybe. That will be another negotiation.
All right, thank you for that. A lot more questions, but I'm gonna stop there, y'all, to open it up to questions, from our participants. And there's two ways that folks can ask questions. You know, for those of you who've engaged before, you can either raise your hand and a call on you, or you can submit a question in the chat box. But we're going to take a few minutes to open up the floor for questions. So floor is open. So we got a couple of questions in the chat, Dorothy. So the first one I see, are the agreements from the COP, like the fund you mentioned, or just basic GHG reductions actually going to be enforced, especially when it is overrun with these lobbyists or Coca-Cola, which was a key sponsor of this particular COP. So everyone knows they were everywhere. And financially, rich countries don't seem to actually be doing anything. Mm-hmm. So that's the first question.
Yeah. Well, the thing with sponsorship, which has been also a lingering problem in the COP. If we look at the COPs, for example, that happened in Poland, so there were three. You have Poznan, you have Warsaw, and you have Katowice. Those three COPs were sponsored by the coal industry. Mm-hmm. And then you have also the South Africa COP, which was built by the civil societies and radical movements there as a conference of polluters. So that's one problem with sponsorship. In Glasgow, as part of the COP26 coalition here in the UK, we really lobbied that all these problematic companies should not end up as sponsors. But then there was a caveat because the UK government said that, well, corporations that agree to the net zero and is actually doing something for the climate. So again, that's another issue of the net zero, because net zero is not similar to zero. It's really kicking the can down the road, and it's a distraction, it's delay, and the COP is a history of delay, moving the goalpost, and a step back from previous agreements. So that's one problem. On the question of how will the agreements, like the fair share on greenhouse gases, that is the problem with, I think, with the nationally determined contribution, and that is why there was I see that when the COP 21 or the Paris Agreement came about, there is a significant lowering of the targets, because before in the Kyoto Protocol, it is clearer that countries, there's a difference on who should decrease their emissions more, which is the Annex 1 countries at that time, and what are those appropriate levels of targets. But in the Paris Agreement, the target became, or the countries were allowed to reduce their emission or to put their pledges on what they are prepared to do, and not on what they must do or what are the appropriate or fair share of those actions. So countries can say, this is our target, although there was a call in the Glasgow COP that countries should go back and review those targets and increase their ambition in those targets. So the US actually increased the ambition, but including civil societies there in the US are also saying that is not yet the fair share of the US. If we talk about the carbon budget, countries like the US and the UK, which are both historic and huge emitters, it should be zero emissions, or even negative numbers, but that's not yet happening. And it is true that financially, rich countries don't seem to actually do anything. If we talk about the $100 billion per year commitment in Copenhagen, until now, they are still up to at the maximum $80 billion. So the 100 billion, which was supposed to be delivered and given to developing countries, that target was moved to 2025. So from 2015 to 2009 COP15 until COP26, that was not delivered, and now the developing countries has to wait until 2025 to actually touch that money, if it will happen in 2025, because now there is still that problem of many rich countries citing the war, the occupation of Russia, of Ukraine, saying that now we have a problem with energy supply, which is actually a problem with speculation as well, and not just the supply, but also the fact that had all these countries did something more ambitious when it comes to fast tracking the renewables, it will not be a problem. The war will not have been a problem now, and we should not let them get away with that excuse that because there is a war, we have to delay our actions on the transition to renewable energy.
Or the other piece that they were doing this COP was the heavy promotion of nuclear energy.
Oh, that too. Because now they're talking about hydrogen as well, nuclear fission. There's all this technology that one, untested, and two, there's that big debate whether can we consider nuclear or also hydrogen as part of renewables or clean energy. Because before, I mean, at the moment, they're already hoodwinking the world by saying that gas is a cleaner source of energy than coal. But the thing is, it is still fossil fuels. And at the same time, there is that question of how do we actually address the problem of energy poverty in many countries. And the problem as well is whether it's renewable or fossil fuels, the question of countries produce energy, but for what, for whom? Because you also have many developing countries that are producing energy for export. You have countries like Laos, which is considered the battery of Southeast Asia. They are producing tremendous energy for export to countries like Thailand. So communities see the cable running through their community, but they still have energy poverty. There are many questions here.
Yeah, there are a couple of more. So we got two from Anissa. What, if any, discussions of degrowth happened at COP27? What do you think? What do you both think about discussions of boycotting COP 28, seeing as it is so corporate dominated? Then Shelley asked the question, where do you feel your greatest agency or our greatest agency lies between now and the next COP? And then we have a hand raised by Manuela. But Manuela, hold on if you can, and let's go through these three questions, and then we'll come to yours.
On the question of the growth, it is, from what it is in the IPCC document, but not yet in the COP text. Actually, this year's intergovernment panel on climate change paper have a lot of firsts. Apart from discussing the growth and recognizing the validity and the importance of the growth in reducing emissions and changing the way the economy works. Because the problem here is that any economic activity emits, produces emission. So the question of not just production but also consumption is a big debate and a big area, and a key area that we have to look into. How can countries reduce its consumption, or how can countries ensure that what we are producing is what is actually needed by people? It requires an overhaul of the economy. So the issue of the growth is not in the text, but it is in the IPCC. So it will take a big push again. How can those science and social policies discussed in the IPCC enter into the COP text is another process of pushing. In terms of boycotting COP28, there is a lot of discussion about organizing an alternative COP, because as we have seen in Egypt, you have a question of difficulty when it comes to democratic space. That unlike in Glasgow, where we had people in Glasgow, 150,000 people on the streets of Glasgow from all walks of life, and also apart from that big demonstration on the National Day of Action on a daily basis, you have youth from the Fridays for Future, you have indigenous people demonstrating on a daily basis in the streets of Glasgow. And there was no limits. In Sharm El Sheikh, we were not allowed to demonstrate outside the UN venue. There are designated areas where you can do those actions, and you even need to permit 2 days before the action is about to take place. So 2 days in advance, and you can only do your action inside. Is a big limit to the rights of groups to demonstrate during the COP, which is seen actually as a period for mass mobilization and mobilization and action. Now the problem with the UAE, one, we are not sure what will be their rules on demonstration, and who do we link up with, because the COP, despite its limits, it remains to be the global political arena for climate politics, and it's also a global. It gives a global opportunity for civil societies, NGOs, movements, social movements to come together, exchange ideas, meet each other, and strategize, and come up with new ideas and actions to do in the next years. The problem with the UAE is the limits of civil society in the country. Many of us, which is also maybe it's also a limit of civil societies in the north and in the south, we don't have contacts or enough contacts in the UAE. I am aware that some unions have contacts with migrant workers in the UAE, but that's a different issue, because it is not easy to transform those migrant organizing with climate organizing. Excuse me. It's not impossible, but you have 1 year to do all those political educations, and also it will not be enough to have a strong partnership. That is, for example, the big difference between Glasgow and Egypt, because in Glasgow we were able to set up a COP26 coalition, which included more than 200 organizations and networks and campaign groups and movements. In Cairo, it was very, very difficult for local Egyptian organizations to join the mobilization. There was a COP27 coalition, which were composed of human rights advocates, some groups and NGOs and campaigners and research organizations, but many of the trade unions, youth, find it difficult to join and also to attend and get a badge, because for the first time as well, normally you get accreditation via the UN system, but in Egypt, NGOs also need to apply to the ministries, to Egyptian ministries, to attend the COP, and they were given a special badge. So opposition parties, the more oppositional civil societies were not granted the badge to attend and link up with international civil society, and we could sense that that will be a problem as well in the UAE. So many are now talking about alternative COP. I'm aware that within groups in Asia, they were discussing that the next COP is actually an Asian COP, the same way that the Egypt COP is an African COP, because within the UN, the hosting of the COP also rotates between Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America. The UAE, there's no such a thing as MENA or Middle East, North Africa country. It is Africa, either Africa or Asia, and the UAE is considered West Asia. Asian groups are saying, since it will be an Asian COP, then it is important that there will be an alternative COP to be held in Asia, where there will be a more robust NGOs and civil society that could organize a response. But an alternative COP is different from an actual COP, because you don't have those delegates from the countries that you can lobby or you can talk to or you can push to agree with your position. And boycotting COP28, many are, the fact that there are those discussions of alternative COP is equivalent also of thinking they will not go to the COP because of the problems I mentioned earlier. So that could be a boycott, but it's still too early to say because there's no official call of boycott. Even Egypt, there were calls from various sectors, but there was no official calls from the constituencies of the UNFCCC for a boycott. There were key people that say they're not joining, like Greta, Naomi Klein, for example, did not go to Egypt, but they did, and they also wrote their articles about why they are not attending. So there could be that as well in COP28. Just to the last question is, and you're still free to put, and there's also a hand by Manuela. What's the greatest agency that lies between now and the next COP? Well, not just the next COP, but we can also discuss about the one after the next one. In Sharm El Sheikh, Lula from Brazil went there, and the next host after Asia will be Latin America. And he offered that Brazil will host the next COP. But of course, that decision maybe it will happen in the intersessional meeting in Bonn in June, to say that, okay, the next COP will be Brazil. If that happens, Lula mentioned that he will ensure that the next COP will be in the Amazon. So that will be very symbolic, and I think that will be a key mobilization period for global climate justice movement and global civil society. The other things that we can do between now and the next COP, at least for the Asian region, there are a lot of big meetings and multilateral processes that are happening in Asia in the next year. You have the G7 in Japan, you have the G20, we have the G20 in India. There's also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting that will happen in Asia, and many Asian countries are now joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There's also, of course, the Bretton Woods meetings in the US. So all these are key multilateral processes that that can be influenced to make sure that there will be a follow-up. Like, for example, that text on the reform of the international financial architecture, so that can be followed up in the Bretton Woods meeting. I think the others, apart from this, on the national level, we have to make sure that our countries will put money on the pot, on the loss and damage pot. At the moment, only small amounts were there. Like here in the UK, Scotland committed 2 million to the loss and damage. That's small but significant, considering that Scotland did that. Denmark also put, I think, equivalent to 120 euro to the pot, but the big countries, the big commitments were not yet there. So we have to push the US, for example, to put money on loss and damage. I think there was a commitment to double, or for the UK, there was a commitment to triple adaptation fund. But we have to note as well that they already have that commitment in Glasgow, and it was not delivered. So there's also a big difference between all these heads of states committing during their time in the leaders' meeting, and then actually doing what they actually putting the money that they committed to. That's another discussion. So we need to make sure that loss and damage pot will be filled, and the developing countries as well as civil societies have mentioned there could be three possibilities. As I mentioned before, tax fossil fuels, tax the 1%, and at the same time, countries should increase their financial commitments. So those are what we need to push, and that's where we could use our agency, our organizations, our influence to push governments.
All right, let's take our last question from Manuela.
Hi. Sorry, I just thought I would say this with my voice. I hope that's okay. Just briefly, I wanted to also just say thanks very much for organizing this. I'm realizing so many things as I listen to you, and I'm really grateful for there being an event to be able to hear from somebody who actually attends these meetings and to get a bit of an understanding of what that is as a space also, because I realize it's, you know, this big thing that we read about in the media, but it's so far away and it becomes so abstract, and it's so easy to become totally cynical about it also. You know, reading those headlines about the corporate participation and the lobbies and all those things. And so some of the things I was going to ask were also partly answered by you already about boycotting and so on. But one thing that I wondered, I don't know if my question is super clear, but was like, how do you teach people, what sort of pedagogy or story do we need about what the COP actually is? Like, it's such a crazy thing, you know. On the one hand, it's like to even understand what kind of institution that is and how people get selected to go there and how it functions as a space is like requires so much education. I feel I have no idea. Like, I'm starting to learn some things from you. And then of course there's all the questions about boycotting it, or but like, I guess my question goes in the direction of like, how do we grasp, speaking from a social movement perspectives, is like, what are the potentials of this kind of meetings? How should we talk about them? What are the key points? Because we can talk about some of these policies, right? And we know some of these keywords like loss and damage, and, you know, maybe I've partly understood what it's about and so on, but is that what we should be talking about, or what sort of, I don't know, you know, what sort of pedagogy do we need to do around this, aside from the question of totally disengaging with it, or just like consuming the news and passively sitting and watching, you know, what big actors are doing?
Thank you for that.
Yeah, we really need to use our agency, not just during the COP, because actually, if you start organizing during the COP and attend it, it's too late already, because all those policies happen. There's those intersessional discussions. There's all those meetings, leaders meetings in various instances like G7, G20. Then there's also leaders meeting called by important presidents throughout the year. So in the national context, we really need to push our governments to change the policy. And there is also the question of how do we address the fact that climate change was actually produced by the model of the economic model that we follow. None of the countries in the UNFCCC process admit that it's the capitalist model that created all these crises. So how do we change the fact that one, that countries in the global north should rapidly decarbonize, and at the same time, the top 1% get taxed for their consumption, 1%, so that it's not just the north. This is now the north and the south, because the richest people in the developing country could have the same consumption level as the rich countries. And also, of course, there's a big difference between the consumption in the rich enclaves in the US and the poorer enclaves in the US. You also have to think that when we talk about the economy, then it is very complex. There's a multiple layer of fights and struggle that we have to push there. The growth is an enticing concept for many developed countries. There's also the Green New Deal, but of course we need to radicalize the Green New Deal. There's also that question of how do we stop the imbalance? There's an imbalance of power and wealth between the North and the South, and between the poor and rich people within our countries. So how do we address that imbalance? And as I mentioned earlier, the disequilibrium, that inequality in the world is not just the result of all humans. There are specific humans that are consumer more, getting wealthier and wealthier. There's the privilege that they don't want to lose. So change doesn't happen because the rich wake up one day and say, "Oh, I will free the slaves." So it was pushed by struggles. The climate reparations will not happen if the North and the Southern movements don't join together and push for climate reparations. Also, the history of the kind of accumulation and the way accumulation of wealth affects billions of people on Earth also tells a lot about how do we stop those the actors of that accumulation. So how do we stop the power of transnational corporations? So and I think there are a lot of discussion how to reform, but I think at this point we really need to discuss how do we stop their power. How do we stop the power of transnational corporations from being the new empires? From countries in the global south, we see transnational from the Philippines, we see transnational corporations as a new empire. They can go anywhere, anytime, and do anything, and there's very, very little that governments can do to stop them or regulate them. In the UN level, there's that agreement on human rights and business, or the UN binding treaty on business and human rights, which started as very promising, but now we are seeing that there's a lot of lowering of ambitions as well. There's even a question how they define who should they now say all business and not just transnational corporations, which is of course a big disappointment. Way back in the 1970s, Allende mentioned that we need a new global order wherein transnational corporations have less power and people have more power. How do we make that happen? How can we push for that reality? How do we also make sure that the fault lines that dominates international climate politics gets addressed? because that's also the problem, both in the COP and outside the COP. You still have the imbalance of power between rich countries and poor countries, and of course, big powers like the US. So for us here in the UK and for movements in the US, all of us are operating in the belly of the beast. How do we make sure that we use the levers that we could use in changing our country? And that's a big responsibility. We need massive popular education for people also to see that we need to change the economy, we need to change consumption, we need to change our attitudes as well. And in terms also of consuming, because it is in the climate talks, it is something that when you have your your chief negotiator saying that the lifestyle of the Americans are not up for negotiation, it's not in the table, sorry. So how do you change that? And for us here in the UK, we have to deal with the problematic government that we have, that continue despite its commitment and hosting the Glasgow COP. Now it just approved the Cumbria coal plant, and on the brink also of approving the Rosebank plant. So that's a problem. You have countries that are committing to this and that treaty, but doing what they still want, and using the war now to say that sorry, we can't fast track the transition to fossil fuels, because as you can see now, we have a problem, we have a war, and we have an energy crisis. And that's the thing. We are not talking about the all these multiple crises, this plurality of crises. And on one hand, it is good that we see climate as a global crisis that needs global cooperation. But then at the same time, changing energy, which is the other side of the coin of climate change, energy is now a security issue. So changing it and changing the energy sector is a key area as well. So how can we include that in our political education? How can we also say that for here the political right in Europe are up in arms with these climate responses, and sadly as well, they are using climate change also in their way of organizing, and they are gaining ground as well. So how do we make sure that the right do not eat our lunch and also not use the climate to pursue their agenda? That's a big assignment for all of us.
Well, that's a lot for us to chew on, a lot for us to build on. Out of respect for your time, Dorothy, I'm going to stop us there now. She's over in the UK, so we're getting close to, I think, 11 there.
Yeah, it's 10:18.
So I want to thank you for joining us. I want to follow up more on these as we go along. I think particularly looking at some of the alternatives that were raised. One of the things, there are a lot of ideas, and I think we should explore those and give folks some background on that in terms of building the movement and doing the education that you're talking about. So we'll keep doing that. Our next discussion in this series is going to be January 18th. It's also going to be about COP, but more it's some of the folks who planned all the different actions at this COP, and kind of get their kind of ground level perspective, and really kind of thinking about how do we lean in on this boycott or engagement question. And then the other piece that we didn't talk about was exclusion, right? The exclusion piece that happened in Glasgow, that happened here, was even more realistic and I think detrimental than kind of a planned boycott. And that's going to be even more intense, definitely in the UAE. So we'll be talking about that a little bit and some things, bouncing some ideas off of what we could possibly do, and looking at the alternatives. That's going to be with Kevin Buckland. So be on the lookout for that. And with that, I want to close. I want to thank everybody for participating. This will be up for those of you who didn't get a chance to kind of like check it out or join us. It'll be up on YouTube and on our social media posts early next week. So let folks know who might have missed it. And I'll see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Take care. Good evening, everybody.
Yeah, take care. Bye.